Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week, having looked in the last episode at the work of Billy Joel, it would be remiss of me not to review the best albums by British piano pop royalty Sir Elton John. Elton John was born in Pinner, just north of London, in 1947. He was born famously Reginald Kenneth Dwight. He went on to study music at the Royal Academy of Music before forming Bluesology in 1962, who went on to back blues singer Long John Baldry by 1967, before Elton fortuitously hooked up with lyricist Bernie Taupin, and he released a solo debut album in 1969. He and Bernie Taupin, of course, went on to have a long and very, very fruitful collaboration together. As an artist, Elton John was phenomenally prolific throughout the 1970s and 80s, despite a very well documented struggle with drink and drugs. He's had a staggeringly successful career. He's sold over 250 million records. He has over, to this day, 45 million Spotify followers. He's fourth on the list of the all-time biggest selling artists, and he's known worldwide by one name in the way that only the all-time greats are. There is no question that in collaboration with Bernie Taupin, Elton has written some of popular music's most famous and everlasting songs. I think, though, he's often regarded as a singles act by people who literally haven't been listening. He's considerably more than that, as any investigation into his classic 70s back catalogue will reveal. He's a very, very versatile melodicist. He's a very live performer who can create not only perfect, unforgettable pop, but, he can also do these almost sort of prog-like epics with complex arrangements that weave in and out of different styles within 5 minutes. And that's a side of him that casual admirers of Elton just may not know. He's also, of course, renowned for his extravagant lifestyle, hosting magnificent parties, crazy stage outfits and live shows. He's at one point he was known as being all about the tiaras and the tantrums. But that said, I don't know anybody with a bad word to say about him. He's a very canny operator, always keeping himself relevant by collaborating with the artists of the day. And aside from the music, he's also a very busy philanthropist and a huge supporter of young talent. And I've used this phrase a few times, but probably never more so aptly. He is a bona fide British national treasure. There's an awful lot to enjoy here, but there is a lot to steer clear of as well. So what treasures lie in his back catalogue of 31 solo albums? Well, let's crack into it and find out. At number 10, I'm going to put his 11th album from 1976, Blue Moves. By 76, Elton had already made 10 albums in a very short space of time, and he toured constantly, and there was no let up with Blue Moves. It's a double album, which is, incredible, because his output in the 70s was already fairly staggering, and he'd already made some double albums along the way as well. But this one does show some signs of wear and tear. It was his first album on his own Rocket label, and it's perhaps not as immediate and upbeat as he is at his best. It's more of a personal, moody, introspective record. It's full of instrumental passages and interludes. The most famous track on here is Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word. The whole album, I think, is beautifully produced by Gus Dudgeon, who was a long-time collaborator with with Elton throughout the 70s. This is one of Elton's personal favourites, but it only got to number 3, ending a long run of consecutive US number 1 records. Number 9, I'm going to put his 8th album from 1974, Caribou. This was recorded in just 1 week. And Elton and producer Gus Dudgeon do feel that a lot of it was sort of quite rushed, but it does contain 2 of Elton's biggest songs and lots of fine album tracks. It opens with The Bitch Is Back and closes with Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. Gus Dudgeon hated the production on this album. He felt that he'd overdone the horns and the synthesizers and all the additional instruments that he added after the band had played their tracks. In many ways, I think this album probably marks the point where Elton left behind the introspective singer-songwriter and became Elton John the showman, kind of as reflected in the cover, where he's wearing this daft outfit, and he became known for wearing lots and lots of daft outfits at his shows and things. There is an expansion in the sound here with Moog synths, and as I said, the horns are much, much more prominent. But the reception was lukewarm at the time, and it's not one of his best albums, but it still went #1 both sides of the Atlantic, double platinum in the US, and it was Grammy nominated for Album of the Year. So it seems even an off-form Elton was still adored by the public and the industry. At number 8, I'm going to put from 1970 his second album, simply entitled Elton John. Elton's debut album, Empty Sky, was a record that seemed to not really appeal to anyone. It didn't have any identity, but Elton and Bernie learnt very quickly that the lyrics on Elton John are much, much more personal, much more focused with tighter melodies and arrangements. That meant this is, I think, really where the Elton John story begins. It opens with his signature tune, which today is still very much his signature tune, Your Song. And it's a very mellow, even orchestral record in parts, but there's shades of country music all over it as well. With you've got the Border song, songs like The King Must Die, Take Me to the Pilot. It's a real singer-songwriter's album, but I think for me it's a bit over-egged in places. It could be stripped back a lot. But still 469 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. And it's in the Grammy Hall of Fame as an album of cultural significance. So, as I say often, what do I know? Clearly not a great deal. At number 7, I'm going to put from 1983 his 17th album, Too Low for Zero. This is the Elton comeback album. After a string of declining sales and creative output, it wasn't at the high level that we'd got used to by the very late 70s, early 80s. A lot of that had to do with Elton's lifestyle and his aforementioned problems with drink and drugs. But this album, as the comeback album, it's significant that this is the point where he also really embraced videos and MTV. The Renaissance really began here, fueled, of course, by the survival anthem on this record, I Am Still Standing. Now, many of you know what I think of a lot of 80s albums, and yes, this is an 80s album. It's produced by Chris Thomas, but it doesn't have the full-on, problems with 80s albums that I often relay on this show. And you can't deny the appeal of some of the songs here. I think Cold as Christmas is an odd opener, but it's quite an affecting breakup song. Kiss the Bride is daft but fun. And I guess that's why they call it the blues. I think is one of his greatest tunes. But this was, again, crucially, the first time since Blue Moves that Bernie Taupin had written all the lyrics. And also he had the core of his 70s backing band back. Nigel Olsson, Dave Murray, not Dave Murray from Iron Maiden, D Murray, and Davey Johnson were all back for this record, and their return, I think, with the conservative 80s production of Chris Thomas makes this a very listenable early 80s album. There is a lot of filler in here, I have to admit that, but I do have great affection for this album because I listened to it a lot growing up, and I probably place this a bit higher than most Elton John fans would. But 7 in the UK, 25 in the USA. So it didn't stop the world, but it did show that there was life in Elton yet. And number 6, I'm going to put his 6th album from 1973, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player. The title came from an evening Elton spent with no less than Groucho Marx, who had been ribbing him all evening. And Elton at one point said, don't shoot me, I'm only the piano player. This was his second US #1 album, and I think this is, Elton at his peak in many ways. He's just rolling out great tune after great tune. There's a lovely pastiching here of the music he grew up with Stax soul and 50s rock and roll. You've got, Crocodile Rock, which is a great example of that. The opening track, Daniel, is a really subtle, beautiful song, and he's using just the core of his band here, aforementioned Olsen, Murray, and Johnston, and it's very direct. It's more of a pop-oriented Elton that we might have got used to on some of those early albums. Elderberry Wine and I Was a Teenage Pop Idol. They're strong Elton deep cuts. As I said, it was his second consecutive #1 in the US, but it was his first UK #1, and Crocodile Rock was his first US #1 single. So at this point, Elton's was very much a high-flying bird, another of the tracks on this album. So we get to the top 5, and at number 5, I'm going to put his fourth album from 1971, Madman Across the Water. Elton was still trying to find a sort of consistency in the album market on his fourth album. And it's reported that Gus Dudgeon was kind of losing faith in Elton's band. And as a result, he brought in some players like Rick Wakeman, Herbie Flowers. They'd even tried Mick Ronson on some songs to add a new dimension to Elton's music. The results are this album, which has got a sort of dark, eerie quality. There's Paul Buckmaster's string arrangements all over it. Some of this album even sounds a bit prog. Elton was quite a fan of prog. Not many people knew that at one point he tried to join King Crimson, no less. The album contains Tiny Dancer and Levon. Tiny Dancer, I think, one of the great album openers of all time, and many people do regard it as one of his very, very greatest songs. Used, of course, to really, really fine effect in the Cameron Crowe film Almost Famous. This is possibly Elton's most haunting record. There's not a lot of brevity here. Every song clocks in at over 5 minutes, and it's a mature work by a young artist. I think it's since gone multi-platinum in the US and gold in the USA, and I think it remains one of his more unexplored but satisfying records. At number 4, from 1975, his 9th album. He'd already made 9 albums by 1975. Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. This was a 10-track concept album about Bernie and Elton themselves and the journey they had been on together making music. To this point, Elton, of course, is Captain Fantastic, and Bernie, who'd always had an obsession with the US and the West, is the Brown Dirt Cowboy. I think it's very affecting. It's a very moving record. It doesn't pull any punches either. They don't try and sort of, this is no hagiography to themselves. The opening track here is an Elton a deep cut classic, I think, and someone. Save My Life Tonight is about Elton's attempted suicide. Go back to what I was saying, it's a very honest record. And the pair, they're not afraid here to confess their deep platonic love for each other either, which on We All Fall in Love Sometimes. Again, a very, very moving grown up piece of music, I think. Philadelphia Freedom closes the album, and we get a pretty good cover of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds along the way. Generally, the sound here feels bigger. The drums are deeper and they're more resounding. And I think that's possibly, as by now Elton was a superstar. He was playing huge stadiums and you have big kind of almost stadium anthems alongside the ballads and the rock and roll and again the country music that Elton nearly said Elvis again, that Elton loves so much. And the great thing is, and this gets overlooked, Elton can sing and play it all. He's a fabulous, fabulous piano player, and he has been a wonderful, wonderful singer. The public loved it. It sold 1.4 million copies in 4 days. I'd be happy to sell 1.4 million copies over 4 decades. Number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic, triple platinum in the US, 198 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time, and Elton himself has said that he thinks that this is possibly his finest album. However, it was the last to feature the core of his own band, Olsen, Murray and Johnston, and I do think that had a detrimental effect on the second half of the 70s on his music. So we get to the top 3, and at number 3 I'm going to put his 7th album from 1973, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Yes, I haven't put it at number 1. Like I'm sure many of you would have done. Look, Elton was at the absolute peak of his powers by now. He could pretty much do no wrong commercially and creatively. It's not hard to see why he had so much confidence, and this was an ambitious set. It's a double album that hops all over the place stylistically, from the sort of cheesy rock and roll of Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting to the piano ballad classic Candle in the Wind, from the pop stomp of Benny and the Jets to the rock progginess of the opener Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding. This record is big, it's fun, it's colourful. I think, though, it's quite an overwhelming album. I've always felt that it's a lot to take in. It's a bit like a sort of Tudor meal. It is just one rich course after another, and I think it's better digested in small courses. There's no denying the quality of the songwriting here, and there's great deep cuts like a Sweet Painted Lady, and the title track is just a masterpiece. It's an absolute masterpiece of melody and of modulation. I truly think it's one of the great pop ballads of all time. But that aside, for me, it's just a bit too much. I prefer my albums, as a lot of you know, to have just a little bit more brevity, and this is 76 minutes long. But it sold over 20 million copies. It's widely regarded as Elton's masterpiece, and it's in the Grammy Hall of Fame and 112 on the greatest albums of all time, Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. So that takes us to the top 2 Elton John albums. At number 2, I'm going to put his third album from 1973. It's Tumbleweed Connection. Now, not for Elton and Bernie to repeat a winning formula, and I think in many respects that's the key to the longevity of their success. Elton's clearly a much more ambitious songwriter than a cursory glance over his greatest hits would attest. And oddly, there's an absolute lack of hits on this album because no singles were released from it in the US. And it's a bit of a curio. It's Elton indulging Bernie's obsession with the USA, the Wild West, and the Civil War. It's hugely inspired by the band and the Americana-style music that the band were producing at the time. And it does sound very band-like in places, and it could easily sound like a pastiche. But Elton is just far too good a vocalist for that. Funnily enough, the whole thing was written entirely before Elton or Bernie had ever been to the US, and it was recorded in London's dingy Trident Studios, but they absolutely nail the vibe all over the record. Crosby, Stills and Nash influences on something like Love Song. You've got Where To Now, St. Peter, Country Comfort, which was beautifully covered by Rod Stewart, Come Down in Time. I think this is an absolutely cracking, focused, thematic, wonderfully played and produced record. Rolling Stone put it number 458 on their greatest albums of all time, got to number 2 in the UK and 5 in the UK, and it's irrefutable proof that there was and is so much more to Elton than the hits. So that brings us to my number 1 Elton John album, and it is his 5th album from 1972, and that is Honky Chateau. So why is this number 1? I think a lot of different Elton fans are going to have different opinions, but I think this is the perfect distillation of all that's great about Elton. It's not the obvious album. Some of you may remember I put Zuma at number 1 on Neil Young's list, and I'm doing it for the same reason here. This is all the things good about this artist wrapped up in a lovely single course meal. It's not as bloated as Captain Fantastic or Yellow Brick Road, and I mean bloated in a sort of kind way, if that's possible. It's one of Elton's most laid back and groovy records, which I think was much needed after the dark introspection of Madman Across the Water. It has ballads, it has blues, rock, soul, country. It's all here, and it's all good. And I think importantly, it's the first album to fully feature Olsen, Murray and Johnson, who all became mainstays of the Elton John band. And as a result, his music really sounds more lively here and more open, less introspective. Album begins with the fun honky cat. Along the way, you've got Susie, you've got Hercules, and the album is undoubtedly most famous for the sublime Rocket Man. But there are melodies and hooks everywhere. He sort of makes me laugh sometimes, Elton John, because he'll make an album of consistently good material, and then somewhere along the way he just knocks it out of the park with tracks like Rocket Man, and also here you've got the beautiful Mona Lisa and Mad Hatters. Rolling Stone called this album a rich, warm and satisfying, and I can't really put it any better than that. 251 on their greatest albums of all time. It was the first of 7 consecutive #1 albums for Elton, and by now the Rocket Man had truly taken off and was heading for the rock star stratosphere. So that's my top 10 Elton John albums. Look, there are plenty of other Elton John albums to explore than those on this list, but in all honesty, very little from the 90s onwards has caught my ear. Some of them are not that bad. Songs from the West Coast, Captain and the Kid, I think are okay records. But much of what I don't like about them has to do with the production on the records. I think there's a magic in Elton's earlier work. There's a purity and a clarity in his voice I love, which I think sadly he lost a little bit after the throat surgery for nodules in 1987. To his credit, though, he still plays all the songs in the original key. But, you know, as much as I try, I find a lot of the music after this collection less appealing. He's made 5 live albums, 22 official compilations, so there's no shortage of Elton out there for you to explore. But in true Rock Records reviewed form, I suggest the top 4, possibly the top 5 here, and a good compilation are all you really need to have Elton covered. But look, you may totally disagree, and I completely respect that, because Elton's had such a long and an interesting career. But so let me know what you think and what your top 10 would be, or top 5 if you're not that familiar with all his work. But I'll be back very soon with another Rock Records reviewed. Until then, take care. Bye bye.